Good morning, I'm Mike Ballinger, publisher of the Bond Buyer. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the CDIAC pre-conference workshop, Obstacles and Opportunities at the Intersection of Public Finance and the Housing Crisis. Well, we're all disappointed this event is not an in-person event. CDIAC has put together an outstanding program. In addition to excellent panels, we're delighted to have California State Senate Majority Leader Robert Hertzberger as our keynote speaker. The Bond Buyers Partnership with CDIAC is now in its 20th year, and both parties have benefited as a result. CDIAC's reputation as a provider of educational programming has encouraged California issuers to attend the Bond Buyer Annual Conference. Kick off the CDIAC pre-conference, it's my pleasure to introduce Robert Barry. Treasurer Fiona Mall appointed Robert to the position of Executive Director of CDIAC in January 2020. Prior to his appointment and since joining CDIAC in late 2010, he served as Deputy Executive Director. In addition to his operational and administrative direction of CDIAC's educational, data collection, and research functions, Robert has assisted CDIAC's research team to conceptualize and carry out some of the more extensive research projects. He was also instrumental in the development and the adoption of CDIAC's first ever set of regulations ushering in the Treasurer's first data transparency site, DebtWatch. Please join me in a warm welcome for Robert Barry.
Thank you, Mike. It's always an honor to be able to kick off the Bond Buyer California Public Finance Conference. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of State Treasurer and CDIAC Chairperson Fiona Ma and all our distinguished presenters, thank you for joining us this morning for the California Debt and Investment Advisory Commission's 20th pre-conference, Obstacles and Opportunities at the Intersection of Public Finance and the Housing Crisis. California's global economic leadership is in very large part rooted in its diversity, the diversity of its geography, cultures, population, and industries. Only one industry classification represents more than 20% of our state's $2.7 trillion GDP. And as we know, diversification is key to mitigating volatility, to endure inevitable economic cycles, and maintain long-term financial sustainability at the state and local level. Maintenance of our economic diversity demands a workforce with an array of experience, knowledge, skill, and ability. While many are, not all Californians are anesthesiologists or database engineers. Workers in manufacturing, education, retail, construction, and agriculture are critical to the economic sustainability and quality of life. And they have found a larger and larger percentage of their incomes consumed by a fundamental human need, housing. While diversity in so many ways has been our strength, one element of diversity that we are sorely lacking is diversity of housing. I'm generalizing when I say this, but we really only have one type of housing, expensive. The Department of Finance reported in September that the August statewide median sales price for existing single-family homes reached $828,000, a 17% increase from a year ago. Fundamentally, we have a supply problem. California is only permitting about 60% of the housing it needs to permit if we're to climb out of this deficit of supply and keep pace with population growth. But as you know, this is an oversimplification because it's not just the number of rooftops. The problem is developing the diversity of supply that meets the diversity of need among Californians at all income levels. We recognize that there are a variety of complex factors that have contributed to the housing crisis, but this morning, we've assembled a group of experts that are prepared to examine the force public finance brings to bear, both obstacles and opportunities at the state and local level. We would like you to come away informed and motivated and optimistic that we'll turn the tide on the housing crisis, in part through the ingenuity, creativity, and sheer dedication of California's public finance community. We have three sessions to the CDIAC pre-conference. In our first introductory session, our speaker will lay the foundation for the program by framing the problem, explaining why public finance is at the center of this challenge. Our next session will be presented in two parts. Part one, our experts will take up the policy and finance challenges with the public-private partnerships that lead to the development of affordable multifamily housing. Then we'll jump right into part two, where our panelists will discuss accessory dwelling unit segment, legislative changes that have created opportunity in this segment, innovative development approaches, and financing concepts that may make ADUs mainstream. Our third session is also presented in two parts. Our experts will discuss in part one the implications for local public finance of a potential surge in new housing and infrastructure demand. Then in part two, Our keynote speakers will discuss opportunities to bring some very forceful public finance solutions to the single-family housing segment. You may ask questions of our presenters by using the Q&A feature, and I will try to squeeze as many questions in as time allows. So let's move to our introductory session. I'm delighted to introduce Mr. Gabriel Petek. Mr. Petek was appointed to the position of Legislative Analyst in February 2019. As a legislative analyst, he serves as the nonpartisan fiscal advisor to both houses of the California Legislature, oversees the preparation of fiscal and policy analysis of the state budget and programs, and prepares impartial analysis of all state ballot initiatives and constitutional measures. Before serving as a legislative analyst, Gabriel worked for 2 decades at S&P Global Ratings and was S&P's primary analyst for the state of California. Gabe, welcome to the pre-conference.
Good morning, and thank you, Robert, and thank you for having me here this morning, especially given the importance of the topic of housing in California. When members of my office and I speak with our bosses in the legislature, housing and relatedly homelessness are almost always in the top 3 of the priorities that they list. And likewise, the governor has consistently made housing and homelessness a top priority of his administration. So if we could go to my slide deck, I have some slides I'll try to go through here this morning to kick off the session. Basically, our office views housing as a major policy issue for the state. This is reflected in our publications, beginning with a significant report back in 2015 where we explored the causes and consequences of high housing costs in California, and we've continued to do frequent research since then on the topic. As we plan our future research, our analysts have continued to identify housing as among the top policy issues that we will continue to do research on and publish on. And while it's not likely that we'll be able to solve California's housing challenge in the near term, state officials have at least 3 things going for them at this time. First is we have a significant level of resources currently available. Second, policymakers, both the legislature, the governor, other elected officials such as the treasurer, seem to have reached a consensus that housing is a key policy priority. And then third, we have the rise of ESG as an investing lens. And within ESG typically is the housing area. And so I would just mention, back in 2015, I began incorporating a comment about housing in my reports on California for the S&P. And since then, they've continued to be reflected in those reports, albeit more formally now, because ESG is a specific rating factor. Okay, so going to the next slide here. Today, I will do a little bit of problem definition, touch on what our office thinks some of the reasons for housing being so expensive in California is. Then I will briefly touch on some of the institutional arrangements we have in the state, recap some of the recent actions, and then leave you with some parting thoughts on what we think the future may hold. Next slide. In the first section, I will go over some of the problem definition aspect of California's housing challenges, some of which Robert already mentioned. On the next slide, what I wanted to just point out here is that Californians spend a larger share of their income on rent or mortgage payments than the rest of the nation. There is particular strain at the lower income quartiles, as you see from the figure, but basically every quartile spends more of their income on housing than in other parts of the nation. The next slide. There are some additional data points to review on the state's housing affordability challenges. First, high housing costs are a key driver of the state's overall poverty rate. While we have an official poverty rate of 11%, which is about average, it goes up to 15% once we take into account the cost of food, clothing, and shelter. So we become the highest in the nation in terms of poverty once we do that. Second, low-income households face the highest rent burden. 2.5 million people in the lower-income household range of the spectrum spend more than 30% of their income on housing. Third, even middle-class households are spending 15% or more of their income on housing. That's 900,000 in this category. So almost 1 million of our households are spending over 15% of their income on housing. And then fourth, only about 1/4 of our low-income households in California are living in subsidized housing or receiving housing vouchers. So this suggests there could be some room for additional policy work. On the next slide, I'll just mention that high housing costs are also directly contributing to the state's homelessness crisis. As we know, California has a disproportionate share of the homeless population. In January 2020, we had about 160,000 homeless individuals, which was 28% of the nation's total, even though our population is only about 12% of the nation. And we know that homelessness is a complex problem, but the high cost of housing is often somewhat glossed over as a major contributing factor. On to the next slide. Here I was going to just touch on, some of what our research suggests are the reasons behind California's high cost of housing. Next slide. As we think about the drivers or the causes behind the state's high home prices, one thing I'd like to say is that it's not a new problem. In fact, California's home prices have increased faster than the nation since around 1940. But it has been accelerating. So from 1970 to 1980, home prices increased from about 30% above the nation to about 80% above. But now home prices are about 250% of the national average. And that's probably out of date information, as we heard Robert say in the opening comments. So next slide, please. So why is why is there such housing price pressure? Well, fundamentally, there's not enough supply. Perhaps to state the obvious, a primary reason for our shortage of supply is we're not producing enough to meet demand. Housing in California has typically, we've been adding about 120,000 units per year. The number dipped to around 100,000 in 2020 during the pandemic. And in most years, the production along coastal California in particular has really lagged. Based on our prior research, we think that California needs to build approximately twice as much housing per year as it's currently building. And within California, when we start looking across the regions, there are significant implications as the spillover of demand from the coast moves to the inland areas of the state. Home prices in the inland parts of the state are also pressured upward. Moving to the next slide. So what we've observed is that over time, land costs are very high, particularly on the coast. And while these higher costs could be offset by denser development, this increase in density along the coast has been quite slow to emerge. There's been resistance to the increased density that could help alleviate some of this pressure. Next slide. But it's not just land prices, of course. In California, we also have higher building costs that contribute to higher housing costs overall. The higher building costs are from higher labor costs, higher costs of materials, and high government fees for housing development. And it seems that all three of these components themselves are higher in California than in other parts of the nation. And so when you put that in combination with the high land costs, particularly on the coast, it really fuels the upward pressure on prices. We go to the next slide. Now I was going to go in briefly recap how California from an institutional standpoint has addressed its housing policy over the years. Let's see, moving to the next slide here. As a brief recap of how California housing needs are estimated and planned, just remind you that since 1969, cities and counties are required to adopt a housing plan as a part of their general plans, which are also required by the state and serve as the blueprints for how the cities and counties will grow and how they will accommodate growth. And there are seven elements to these plans. Housing, of course, is one of them. The thing that I would just mention about this is that the state really only has a limited role in the first step, which is identifying the estimated amount of housing that each region will need. Then after that, the regions themselves, through the councils of government throughout the regions, allocate the needed housing to the different cities and counties. And then the cities and counties incorporate this housing element into their plans via their zoning policies. So it really comes down to zoning. If we could move to the next slide. I will not have time to go through these all. You'll have access to these slides, but one thing I would just point out is that there are significant limitations to our housing element process in California. One of them that I would mention is just that the demographic projections themselves that we use structurally underestimate housing demand. That's because the projections are largely based on extrapolations from past trends. And to the extent that in the past, households have been forced to locate elsewhere, those households and their demand to live in a particular region is therefore not factored in because they aren't a part of the past trend. So we have a problem where we're sort of structurally underestimating and building these the level of demand for housing into our plans. We also have too short of a time period. We look out 8 years in our RENA process. And when you think about it, housing decisions made today will shape communities for decades to come. So we think the time frame is probably too short. Moving to the next section, I'll just, in recent years, one thing that I mentioned is optimistically is that as the challenges become more acute, state policymakers have really begun to take a more active role in trying to facilitate more housing development. Next slide. And this has really begun to shift the state and local relationship, which presents certain challenges. But in recent years, the legislature has adopted major housing legislation beginning in 2017 in particular, with 17 bills that year. In 2020, there were more, and in 2021, the governor has signed 21 pieces of legislation related to housing. Next slide. On this slide, which again you can get access to later, it catalogs some of the major investments in housing related policy. And the thing I would point out is that you see that it's increasing in recent years. So the most recent budget process had the largest amount of new housing resources made available. Next slide. For the public finance community, voters have also provided resources. We've got in 2018, the Affordable Housing Bond Act, Veteran and Affordable Housing Bond Act, and also the No Place Like Home Proposition 2 initiative. Finally, moving to the next slide, if we could just move to the slide 20, I just wanted to, next slide, please. Yeah, I was just going to leave you with a couple of thoughts. We think that the conversation on housing and homelessness will need to continue at a focused level. There are certain thoughts that we've had and written about in our publications, but what it comes down to is that there's somewhat of a tension between the state and the local authorities. So that's going to require continued collaboration. The California Environmental Quality Act is something that we have not taken a position on as an office previously, but we do think that when you consider the fact that certain legal challenges opponents can bring through the CEQA process means that a single individual can slow or terminate a development project that has been approved by local government and maybe even broadly supported by the community, we think that does suggest that this is an area where there will need to be some reforms that are warranting consideration. We don't diminish the fact that it would we don't deny the fact that it would require difficult conversations from stakeholders, but it is something we think policymakers will want to consider discussing in the future. So we have some other points here, but I am running out of time, so I will leave it there at this point, Robert. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabe. That's going to bring us to a close of our first session. I really appreciate the quick yet solid foundation for the discussion that will follow this morning. Now we'll take a 10-minute break to change our meeting rooms, and then I hope you'll all return for our second session.